Have you ever wondered what would happen if a wild predator showed up at your doorstep begging for help? Would you risk everything to save it? This is the incredible true story of how one man's act of compassion changed his life forever. The howling wind tore through the dense forest, bending frost-covered branches into unnatural shapes. Snowflakes spiraled against the log walls of my isolated cabin, deep in the heart of Montana's wilderness. Inside, the dim glow of my cast-iron wood stove cast long, flickering shadows across the room. I'm Jack Thornton, a wildlife photographer who retreated to this remote patch near Glacier National Park almost 2 years ago. My trusty Nikon D850 had been my only connection to the outside world, capturing the untamed beauty of this harsh yet mesmerizing landscape. The walls of my cabin were adorned with photos, elk grazing in morning mist, a bald eagle soaring over Lake McDonald, a snow-covered ridge glinting in the weak winter sun. Despite the comfort these images brought, an eerie silence pressed on my chest, a constant reminder of all I'd left behind. A sharp crack of shifting ice outside made me sit upright. Shadows played tricks in the dim light, the towering trees shifting with the relentless wind. Then I heard it, an unmistakable sound. A low, guttural whimper, almost like a dog's, but deeper, more primal. My pulse quickened. There shouldn't be anyone or anything this close to the cabin. The nearest road was 5 miles away, and most creatures avoided human habitation during these brutal winter months. Cautiously, I moved to the frosted window, my breath fogging the glass as I peered into the snowy expanse. At first, all I could see was white, the endless white of winter draped over the earth like a burial shroud. And then it moved. A large figure, dark against the snow, hunched low near my porch. It was a bear, but not the robust, majestic kind I'd seen lumbering confidently through the forest in summer. This bear was gaunt, its fur clumped with ice. Steam rose faintly from its nostrils as it panted heavily, its front paw pressed awkwardly into the snow. Jesus, I muttered, my mind racing. This was a grizzly, Ursus arctos hyribilis, a species both revered and feared in these parts. Normally, such a creature would steer clear of humans, especially during hibernation season. But this bear looked desperate, and desperation could mean danger. I grabbed my flashlight from the kitchen counter, clicked it on, and opened the door just a crack. A gust of icy wind rushed in, biting my face. The bear barely flinched at the light, only shifting slightly to meet my gaze. Its eyes, amber pools of exhaustion, stared back at me with an intensity I couldn't ignore. "Are you hurt?" I whispered, as if expecting an answer. The bear let out a low rumble, more a groan than a growl. It lifted its injured paw and limped a step closer, its massive frame sagging under its own weight. Every instinct screamed at me to slam the door, to lock myself away from this powerful predator, but something about the bear's movements, its labored breathing, stopped me. This wasn't aggression. It was a plea. All right, I muttered, more to myself than to the bear. Grabbing a thick wool blanket, I stepped cautiously onto the porch, my boots crunching in the snow. I stopped just short of the bear, who stood shivering in place. Up close, the animal's condition was even worse. Its coat was patchy, its ribs prominent beneath the fur. Frost clung to its whiskers like tiny icicles. "Let me see," I said, my voice low and steady. The bear shifted its weight, lowering its head as though resigned. It was then I noticed the deep gash on its paw, the skin raw and blackened around the edges, frostbite creeping in. "You poor thing," my voice cracked as I wrapped the blanket around the bear's shoulders. It didn't resist, only flinched slightly as the warmth touched its icy fur. With one cautious step at a time, I guided the bear inside the cabin. The heat from the wood stove hit the bear immediately. It collapsed onto the wooden floor with a heavy thud, its breathing labored but steady. I stood frozen, gripping the edge of the table for support. A bear, a grizzly, was lying in my cabin mere feet away. And yet, as surreal as it was, I felt no fear. Only an overwhelming wave of pity. I retrieved a first aid kit from a cabinet, along with a jar of honey, real Montana clover honey I'd bought from a roadside stand months ago. I set the jar near the bear, unsure if it could eat in its condition. To my surprise, the bear's nose twitched, and with great effort it licked at the honey, its tongue curling around the jar's rim. "That's it," I murmured. "You'll be all right. We'll figure this out." As I sat down on the floor beside the bear, exhaustion hit me like a tidal wave. But for the first time in years, it wasn't the heavy, suffocating kind of exhaustion that had plagued me since the accident. It was the kind that came with purpose. the kind that made me feel, if only for a moment, alive again. Outside, the wind howled on, but inside, there was only the soft crackle of the fire and the sound of the bear's labored breathing. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel entirely alone. The morning broke slowly, a pale gray light creeping into the cabin through frost-rimmed windows. Outside, the storm had left a fresh blanket of snow, smooth and untouched except for the jagged trail of paw prints leading to the porch. Inside, the warmth of the wood stove painted the walls with a faint golden glow, but it wasn't enough to shake the chill from my bones. I had spent the night in the leather chair, dozing lightly with one ear tuned to the sounds of my unexpected guest. The bear lay sprawled on the cabin floor, its sides rising and falling in uneven breaths. The blanket I had draped over it was damp now, melted snow seeping into the coarse fibers. The creature stirred, its amber eyes flickering open, glassy with fatigue but more alert than they had been the night before. I approached slowly, keeping my movements deliberate. "Hey there," I said softly, crouching a safe distance away. "Looks like you made it through the night." The bear blinked, its gaze following me as I reached for the first aid kit on the counter. My hands trembled slightly as I rummaged through the contents: antiseptic wipes, bandages, a small tube of antibiotic ointment. These were tools meant for human wounds, but they would have to suffice. "I'm going to help you," I murmured, more to calm myself than the bear. "Just don't bite me, okay?" The bear's injured paw rested awkwardly on the floor, the raw gash stark against the pale fur. I knelt and placed the first aid kit beside me, taking a moment to steady my breathing. The air between us felt thick, charged with a fragile trust that could shatter with one wrong move. I reached out cautiously, my fingers brushing against the paw. The bear flinched, a low growl rumbling in its chest, but it didn't pull away. "Easy," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I know it hurts. Just hold still." I began cleaning the wound, the antiseptic wipe drawing a hiss of pain from the bear. I winced in sympathy, my own heart aching as I worked. The gash was deep, deeper than I'd realized, and frostbite had set in along the edges, turning the tissue black and brittle. I applied the ointment carefully, wrapping the paw in layers of gauze until it resembled a makeshift boot. "There," I said, sitting back on my heels. "Not perfect, but it'll do for now." The bear lifted its head slightly, its eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that made my chest tighten. It wasn't gratitude, at least not in the way humans expressed it, but there was something there, a flicker of understanding that left me momentarily breathless. I rose and moved to the kitchen, where I rummaged through the cabinets for something the bear could eat. I found a can of salmon, the label faded but still legible, and opened it with a manual can opener. The sharp metallic click echoed in the quiet cabin, drawing the bear's attention. I set the can on the floor a few feet away and stepped back, giving the animal space. The bear sniffed the air, its nose twitching before dragging itself toward the food. It ate slowly, its movements heavy with exhaustion but deliberate. As the bear ate, I leaned against the counter, arms crossed over my chest. I watched in silence, my mind a whirl of questions. Why had the bear come to me? How had it known I would help? And what had driven it to such desperation in the first place? The storm had passed, but the forest beyond the cabin remained shrouded in an eerie quiet. It was the kind of stillness that pressed on my nerves, as though the world itself was holding its breath. My gaze drifted to the window, where the snow-covered landscape stretched out in pristine isolation. I had chosen this life for its solitude, seeking refuge from the chaos of the world and the chaos in my own mind. But now, with this unexpected visitor lying wounded on my floor, I felt a strange sense of connection. It was as though the bear's presence had shifted something within me, stirring emotions I had long buried. After finishing the salmon, the bear rested its head on the floor, its breathing slowing into a steady rhythm. I approached cautiously, retrieving the empty can and placing it in the sink. I couldn't help but smile faintly at the sight of the massive creature sprawled out like an overgrown dog. "You a fighter, aren't you?" I said, my voice tinged with admiration. "Guess that makes two of us." The day unfolded in a series of quiet moments. I busied myself with small tasks, adding logs to the fire, sweeping the floor, and preparing my own meager breakfast of oatmeal and instant coffee. All the while, I kept an eye on the bear, who remained mostly still, its energy conserved for healing. By midday, the sun had broken through the clouds, casting pale beams of light across the snow. I ventured outside to check on my generator, the cold biting at my cheeks as I trudged through the drifts. The world felt eerily empty, the usual sounds of the forest birdsong, the rustle of branches, noticeably absent. When I returned to the cabin, the bear was awake, its head lifted as it stared at the door. I paused, following its gaze. Something about the bear's posture seemed deliberate, intentional. "What is it?" I asked, stepping inside and closing the door behind me. The bear turned its head toward me briefly, then back to the door, its nose twitching as though catching a scent. I frowned, my pulse quickening. "You trying to tell me something?" The bear huffed softly, a sound that was neither aggressive nor dismissive. My heart thudded in my chest as I moved closer, my mind racing with possibilities. Whatever had brought the bear to my cabin, I was beginning to suspect, was far from over. The sun had begun its slow descent, casting long shadows across the snow-covered landscape. Inside the cabin, I paced near the window, glancing at the bear. Its steady gaze remained fixed on the door, an unspoken urgency radiating from its massive frame. "What's out there?" I murmured, though I didn't expect an answer. I rubbed my temples, my breath fogging in the cool air of the cabin. I had spent the better part of the afternoon trying to decipher the bear's behavior, but no matter how I analyzed it, I kept circling back to one undeniable truth. The bear was waiting for something, or someone. The bear shifted, its massive paw scraping against the floor as it tried to rise. I instinctively moved closer, hands half raised as though I could steady the creature, but the bear ignored me, its focus unwavering. It took one unsteady step toward the door and paused, looking back at me with an expression that could only be described as pleading. "You want me to follow you, don't you?" I said softly, my voice wavering, a mix of curiosity and hesitation. The bear let out a low rumble, not threatening, but insistent. It nudged its nose toward the door, then glanced back at me again. The message was clear. Outside, the air was sharp and biting, the kind of cold that gnawed at exposed skin within seconds. I pulled my heavy parka tight around me, the hood lined with faux fur brushing against my cheeks. My boots crunched over the thick layer of snow as I followed the bear, its lumbering gait surprisingly steady despite its earlier weakness. The landscape stretched out in every direction, an expanse of white broken only by the dark silhouettes of spruce and pine. The forest seemed alive in its stillness, the occasional groan of trees bending under the weight of snow punctuating the silence. Above us, the sky was a pale canvas, streaked with hues of lavender and rose, the remnants of daylight fading fast. I kept a cautious distance from the bear, my eyes darting between its injured paw and the path ahead. Tracks in the snow told the story of our journey, a single set of deep paw prints now joined by the smaller, hesitant prints of my own boots. The bear paused suddenly, its ears twitching. I stopped too, my breath hitching. I strained to hear, but all I caught was the faint whistle of the wind through the trees. The bear tilted its head, listening to something I couldn't discern, before resuming its slow, deliberate march. "Where are you taking me?" I muttered, though my words were lost in the icy air. We came to a narrow ridge, the trees thinning to reveal a steep drop into a shallow ravine. Snow had piled against the edges, creating precarious overhangs that threatened to collapse under the slightest weight. The bear stopped at the ridge's edge, lowering its head to sniff the ground. I approached cautiously, my heart pounding. "Easy now," I said, my voice steady despite the tightness in my chest. "I'm right here." The bear turned its head to look at me, amber eyes glinting in the fading light. Then it let out a sound, half growl, half moan, and stepped forward onto the slope, its injured paw sinking deep into the snow. I hesitated. The slope was treacherous, the kind of terrain that could break bones if one misstep sent me tumbling. But the bear didn't seem to care. It forged ahead, its massive frame moving with a mix of determination and urgency. As I followed, my boots slipped against the icy surface, forcing me to grab at low-hanging branches for support. The descent was slow and painstaking, each step a test of balance and will. The cold air stung my lungs, and my fingers, encased in thick gloves, ached with the effort of gripping the rough bark. Finally, we reached the bottom of the ravine. The bear stopped, its head lifting to sniff the air again. It let out a low rumble and began walking toward a dark shape partially obscured by snow, a jagged outcrop of rock that jutted from the earth like the spine of some ancient beast. My eyes narrowed. The outcrop was more than just a geological anomaly. It was a cave, its entrance partially hidden by snowdrifts and fallen branches. "You brought me here for this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The bear didn't respond, of course, but its actions spoke louder than words. It limped toward the cave, pausing at the entrance to look back at me. I stood rooted to the spot, my mind struggling to process what was happening. The bear huffed impatiently, as if to say, "Well, are you coming or not?" Taking a deep breath, I followed the bear into the darkness of the cave. The temperature dropped noticeably as we moved deeper, the sound of our breathing echoing off the damp walls. I fumbled for my flashlight, clicking it on to reveal a sight that made my heart skip a beat. There, nestled in a makeshift den of leaves and branches, were two bear cubs. They were tiny, no more than a few weeks old, their eyes barely open. One of the cubs stirred at our approach, letting out a weak, mewling sound that tugged at my heartstrings. "Oh my God," I breathed, understanding dawning on me like a bolt of lightning. The injured bear wasn't just any bear. She was a mother, desperate to save her cubs. The mother bear limped over to her cubs, nuzzling them gently with her nose. The little ones stirred, their tiny paws reaching out for their mother's warmth. But something was wrong. Even in the dim light of my flashlight, I could see that one of the cubs was barely moving, its breathing shallow and labored. "They're sick," I murmured, my heart sinking. "That's why you came to me, isn't it? You needed help." The mother bear turned her amber eyes to me, and in that moment, I saw a depth of emotion I never thought possible in an animal. There was fear there and desperation, but also a glimmer of hope. She had risked everything, venturing out in the dead of winter, injured and weak, on the slim chance that a human might help her save her babies. I knelt beside the cubs, my hands shaking as I reached out to touch them. Their fur was matted and damp, their little bodies trembling with cold and hunger. The weaker cub barely reacted to my touch, its eyes glazed over with exhaustion. "Okay," I said, more to myself than to the bears. "Okay, we can do this. We have to do this." With as much gentleness as I could muster, I scooped up the cubs, cradling them against my chest. The mother bear watched intently but didn't interfere, seeming to understand that this was her children's best chance at survival. "Come on," I said to her, my voice cracking with emotion. "Let's get them somewhere warm." The journey back to the cabin was a blur of determination and fear. The mother bear followed close behind as I trudged through the snow, the precious cargo of her cubs held tightly against me. By the time we reached the cabin, night had fallen and the temperature had plummeted even further. Inside, I quickly set about creating a warm, safe space for the cubs. I gathered every blanket and pillow I could find, arranging them near the wood stove where the heat was strongest. The mother bear watched my every move, her eyes never leaving her babies as I gently placed them on the makeshift bed. "They need food," I muttered, rummaging through my cabinets. I found some powdered milk left over from my last supply run and mixed it with warm water, creating a thin formula that I hoped would be close enough to bear milk to help. Using an eyedropper, I carefully fed the cubs, my heart soaring as they began to suckle weakly. The stronger cub took to it quickly, its tiny paws kneading the air as it drank. The weaker one struggled, but with patience and persistence, it too began to eat. Hours passed in a haze of feeding, warming, and watching. The mother bear never left her cub's side, her massive body curled protectively around them. I dozed off and on in my chair, always jerking awake at the slightest sound. As dawn broke, casting a pale light through the windows, I awoke to a sight that brought tears to my eyes. Both cubs were nursing from their mother, their little bodies wriggling with newfound strength. The weaker cub, which I had feared might not make it through the night, was holding its own, its tiny voice joining its siblings in a chorus of contented squeaks. "You did it," I whispered to the mother bear, my voice thick with emotion. "You saved them." The bear lifted her head, her amber eyes meeting mine. In that moment, I felt a connection that transcended the barriers between species. We were no longer predator and prey, human and wild animal. We were simply two beings who had come together in a time of need, united by the universal drive to protect and nurture life. Days turned into weeks, and as the cubs grew stronger, so did the bond between us. I found myself talking to them, sharing stories of my life before the cabin, of the world beyond the forest. The mother bear, whom I had started calling Luna for her golden eyes that reminded me of the moon, seemed to listen with an uncanny understanding. As spring began to creep into the forest, bringing with it the first tentative buds and the return of birdsong, I knew our time together was coming to an end. The cubs were now strong enough to venture outside, their curiosity about the world growing by the day. On a crisp morning in early April, I opened the cabin door to find Luna standing there, her cubs tumbling playfully at her feet. She looked at me, then at the forest beyond, and I knew it was time. "You ready to go home, aren't you?" I said, my voice catching in my throat. Luna rumbled softly, nudging her cubs gently with her nose. They scampered down the porch steps, their little bodies strong and healthy, a far cry from the weak, sickly creatures I had first encountered in that cold cave. I walked with them to the edge of the clearing, my heart heavy with the impending farewell. Luna paused at the tree line, turning to face me one last time. Her eyes, those intelligent, soulful eyes that had first captivated me on that stormy night, held mine for a long moment. "Thank you," I whispered, though the words felt inadequate for the profound impact this experience had had on me. Luna let out a soft huff, as if in acknowledgement. Then, with one last look, she turned and lumbered into the forest, her cubs bounding along beside her. I watched until they disappeared among the trees, the sound of snapping twigs and rustling leaves fading into the distance. As I stood there, alone once more in the vast wilderness, I realized that I was not the same person who had retreated to this cabin 2 years ago. The bears had awakened something in me, a connection to the natural world, and a sense of purpose I had thought long lost. I turned back to the cabin, my mind already racing with plans. There were calls to make, research to do. I couldn't go back to my old life of isolation, not now that I had seen the impact one act of kindness could have on the delicate balance of nature. As I stepped inside, my gaze fell on my camera, gathering dust on a shelf. I picked it up, feeling its familiar weight in my hands. There were stories out here, important stories that needed to be told, and I was going to tell them. The bears had come to me in their hour of need, and in doing so, they had saved me too. They had reminded me of the beauty and resilience of life, of the interconnectedness of all living things. And as I looked out at the forest, teeming with hidden life and untold stories, I knew that my own story was far from over. It was, in fact, just beginning.